So RFK Jr. is running for president as a Democrat against Joe Biden, and I'm not supporting anyone, but I will support everything that makes the Democrats and the Republicans look like fucking fools, and because they are, and that's what he's doing so far. And I know everybody wants to make him just about vaccines, but he actually talks about a lot of other things that may or may not be important. If you think they're important, then maybe you might want to listen to them. Uh, but there will be these endless attacks against him that all just focus on vaccines. Um, but I'm going to show you a clip here that's he's saying some pretty important stuff, and the Democratic apparatus. I mean, he's primarying against Joe Biden. The Democratic apparatus has got to be shitting their pants right now that you have the name Kennedy going up against Joe Biden and actually calling out all of the things that you cannot speak about, or many of the things that you cannot speak about in these parties, in mainly both of the mainstream parties, both of the corporate sold out piece of garbage parties. But anyway, let's watch a little of this, and I'll just comment as we go. Oh, and for those who don't know, RFK Jr. has I don't actually know what the technical term is, but he has a like a speech impediment that causes his voice to kind of warble. So that's, if you're wondering why it sounds like that.
My uncle came into office 2 months later. He was fighting his intelligence apparatus, his military, because they wanted to invade.
If anyone doesn't know, when he says my uncle, obviously he means JFK, John F. Kennedy.
They wanted to do the Bay of Pigs. He was totally against it, and he let them roll over him. And in the middle of the Bay of Pigs, he realized they were lying to him, and he realized the function of the intelligence agencies had become to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of war. And he came out during the middle of the night during the Bay of Pigs catastrophe, and he said, I want to take the CIA. Alan Dulles had lied to him, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, Louis Lemitzer, Curtis LeMay had all lied to him through their teeth. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
So this is a very important history that a lot of people don't know. JFK turned against the CIA. He did not come into office as a dove or anything, but he did not want to invade Cuba. Cuba, as most of you know, had a revolution. They had thrown off their capitalist chains. The U.S. was horrified that a country so close to capitalist America could get rid of capitalism, and furious. So he did sign off on the Bay of Pigs, the initial Bay of Pigs invasion, which was training these people in Florida and sending them back into Cuba, their home country. They wanted to basically undo Cuba's revolution. So the U.S. helped them do that, but it was not technically, it's kind of like the proxy war in Ukraine. It was not technically the U.S. invading Cuba. And the U.S. wanted to stop short. Well, Kennedy wanted to stop short of the U.S. invading Cuba. Now, what RFK Jr. just mentioned there, to give it a little more clarity, is that it was an utter disaster. I mean, this was a handful of guys showing up on the beach in Cuba, trying to bring down the entire government and going up against basically the entire Cuban military. And they didn't last long. Now, what Kennedy realized, he's saying he realized it was a sham or whatever, it was a fraud, and he'd been lied to. How he'd been lied to is the Joint Chiefs, the top of the military brass, including the top of the CIA, Alan Dulles, as RFK Jr. just mentioned, had told him that this Bay of Pigs would work. And he realized quickly that once it had started and it was a catastrophe, that they knew it wouldn't work. And the reason they wanted to do it anyway, the Joint Chiefs and top of the CIA, et cetera, was because they had thought that the moment that Kennedy saw how bad it was going, he would then send in the U.S. military to back up the Bay of Pigs, to back up the Cubans trying to take their country. And he didn't fall for it. He said, well, we're not sending U.S. troops and jets and every bombing and everything into Cuba. And so he didn't fall for it. And then that's when he walked out and said, I want to smash the CIA and scatter it to the winds. Famous quote attributed to JFK. Now, between that and let's see if he mentions, I know in another interview, RFK Jr., another recent interview, RFK Jr. has talked about Operation Northwoods, but I can't remember if he says it on this one. So let me see.
And, George W. Bush.
Okay, I'll play that. I'll play the rest in a second. But he doesn't get into Operation Northwoods, but he did in a different interview. Operation Northwoods was top of the Joint Chiefs, everything, had come up with this plan to commit false flags. A real life, and this isn't, Alex Jones bullshit. It's a false flag. This was legitimate, a plan for a false flag, which is basically killing your own civilians and blaming it on another country. They had a plan that they brought to Kennedy's desk that said, we could set off some explosions, small explosions in Florida, blame it on Cuba, and, kill a few people. A few people got to die. And then we invade Cuba because we claim that Cuba killed our civilians. And that was the plan they brought to him, called Operation Northwoods. You can look it up. I also covered it. We covered it extensively on Government Secrets, my other podcast. So they came to him and said, our Pentagon came to Kennedy and said, we would like to kill American citizens in order to invade Cuba. And Kennedy was horrified the way it went. So those two things together, Operation Northwoods and the Bay of Pigs, which was a trick to get Kennedy to invade Cuba, made him realize that the intelligence apparatus and the Pentagon, but he hated the CIA more, were not on his side. And he did some things to break them up. He said he was going to decrease the budget of the CIA by 20% during his first term, and eventually decrease it so much that it basically wasn't operating, at least not the same. And he fired Allen Dulles, who was the Titan head of the CIA. Now, a couple of things about Allen Dulles is, according to all reports, Allen Dulles, no longer at the CIA, continued to essentially run the CIA because everyone was so loyal to him that they were all calling him up and asking him for his advice and how to run things and everything. So he continued to run the CIA against Kennedy, even after he'd been fired. But then beyond that, he's then put in charge of the Warren Commission to investigate who killed Kennedy. Well, who do you think killed Kennedy? Knowing all this about how Kennedy was up against the CIA. So basically, they put one of Kennedy's killers, or at least one who knew of what was going to happen to Kennedy, as the head of the Warren Commission to investigate the murder of Kennedy. Anyway, so now I want to play what he says about George W. Bush, although I have some issues with it. But in a few minutes, I'm going to continue this at rumble.com/Lee Camp. That's rumble.com/Lee Camp. Join me there for free. This live stream will just continue there soon, but I'll go ahead and play this clip.
George W. Bush had the same problem. George W. Bush says the worst mistake he made as
so this whole George W. Bush had the same problem. It's bullshit. Anyway, I'll talk more about it in a second.
Mistake he made as president was listening to CIA Director George Tenet tell him it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And so the neocons and CIA got to go into Iraq. And
so he said the biggest mistake, George W. Bush says the biggest mistake he made was listening to the head of the CIA say that WMD was a slam dunk. Now, George W. Bush is such a moron that I don't actually know how much George W. Bush knew, but we know that his administration, Dick Cheney, etc. Thanks, Eugene. Dick Cheney, etc., they didn't actually care whether there was WMD in Iraq. They knew they didn't have proof of WMD in Iraq. They told the CIA to basically find WMD in Iraq or evidence of it. And they didn't care. They wanted to destroy Iraq because it was outside of the petrodollar. It was outside of the U.S. as the global reserve currency. And it was a powerful country in the Middle East, in oil country, one of the main oil producers in the world, in that region, that was setting an example to other countries in that region that you could be outside the petrodollar. And to the ruling elite in the United States, that was a existential threat, as was Gaddafi doing the same thing, as was Syria. And so, George W. Bush was basically doing what Cheney told him to. But the idea that, I don't know, I think RFK is correctly quoting George W. Bush, but I think George W. Bush is full of shit. I think he and the whole administration they knew there was no WMD in Iraq, and they didn't care. Both. They didn't care that it was there. They didn't care that it wasn't there. They didn't care that there wasn't real evidence. They knew there wasn't there, that the inspectors hadn't found anything, but they just wanted a reason. They said within a day of 9/11 that they were going into Iraq. That was they knew. So this idea that George W. Bush was just flummoxed by the CIA. Oh God, they got me again. I don't buy it.
And throw out and do regime change, and we got now we've spent $8 trillion, and what do we get for that $8 trillion? Nothing. Worse than nothing.
Well, so actually they got what they wanted, right? Now he means, what do the American people get for it? Nothing. But in terms of what the ruling elite in the United States got for it, they got what they wanted, which was to create a failed state or a puppet state, a vassal state, which Iraq is close enough to a vassal state. It's kind of a vassal failed state. But to create a puppet situation in Iraq so that you would know the United States, the U.S. empire, would no longer have the threat of a major oil Middle East country being outside the petrodollar. And, one of the earliest things that the new Iraqi government did was go back into the petrodollar fold. One of the best examples of this was in Libya, when the U.S. tells NATO and convinces NATO that Libya and Gaddafi needs to be destroyed. Before there was even a government in Libya, like there wasn't even, it was like there were rebels and things, and there was just fighting and warring factions and all this shit. In the middle of that, like the moment Gaddafi was no longer running the show, they immediately created a new central bank for Libya that was connected to the global central banking system. That was step one, because that was the main goal that the U.S. and NATO were going after. So anyway, but in terms of what the American people are told by liberals, we got nothing out of Iraq, right? We didn't. We also didn't steal their oil. A lot of people think that the U.S. went into Iraq for oil. We didn't steal much oil from Iraq. In fact, Trump, who was terrible at keeping these things secret correctly, said we didn't steal the oil in Iraq. Why didn't we take the oil? He said if I'd been president, we would have kept the oil. So, a lot of people think we just went into Iraq for oil, but we didn't really take much oil from Iraq.
Iraq is now much worse off than it was when we went in there. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein ever did. We may have killed 1 million Iraqis. Nobody knows the number.
And he's correct that the estimate is 1 million Iraqis. I mean, they continue to die today thanks to depleted uranium and other destructions of other forms of destruction of their infrastructure. But so it's 1 million Iraqis plus 5 million in other countries involved in the global war on terror, including Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen. So all told, it's 6 million almost entirely innocent people dying in our global war on terror.
It is an incoherent country today with where Shia death squads are fighting with Sunni death squads in the street. The government is corrupt. The police are corrupt. We created ISIS. We drove.
Government is corrupt and police are corrupt. Same here, though. I don't know if we can really be critical of that. By the way, I'm going to wrap this up at rumble.com/Lee Camp. I also have other stories I'm bringing to you as well. So join me at rumble.com/Lee Camp. But I'm going to keep playing this clip from RFK Jr. We're going to get into more of it. And become a member at leecamp.net, and you get my my new book, Dangerous Ideas, for free. Actually, in a few minutes, I'm going to go through some of what's in Dangerous Ideas. I think you'll really enjoy that as well. But all right, join me at rumble.com/Lee Camp. That's rumble.com/Lee Camp. Unless you're on locals, by the way. If you're at leecamp.net, my locals page, then obviously that live stream will continue as well. Sorry if I didn't clarify that.
2 million refugees up into Europe. They destabilized democracy for a generation in Europe. They caused Brexit. This is the cost of the Iraq war. $8 trillion there, 16 trillion for the lockdowns, 24 trillion, nothing to show except a devastated middle class in the United States of America, and we need to put an end to that.
So there's a lot of important stuff that he's talking about there, and I don't really endorse candidates. I think that talking about the presidential shit show for 2 straight years is insanity. But I will say this: when there's someone that is getting attention, that has crowds, that is in front of a podium and saying important things that are tearing apart the two-party garbage system that is destroying our world, I'm going to highlight those videos. So this is not me saying everyone run out and donate. In fact, in the last 2 live streams ago or something, I told you why RFK Jr. actually can't win, because they instituted they put something into the bylaws of the DNC saying they can eliminate anyone they want from winning the nomination if they don't believe you're Democrat enough. So they can basically just vote that he's not Democrat enough and he'll be out. But I think these are important matters to talk about, and he is talking about a lot of them. So I'm going to highlight those videos when I can.